Good morning, and thank you, Karin. It's really inspiring to be here. This room is filled with friends, mentors, people that are responsible for my career. I'm sorry to all of you for that. I'll make that up to you at some point. It's really incredible, and I have superstar patients as well sitting in this room. It's really incredible to come together as a community to talk about these challenges. In my career, the two things that I focus on every day is one, inspiring transplant hospitals, transplant doctors to choose more organs, and inspiring patients to choose life. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today. And this is the topic that we thought was going to resonate. You're going to hear a lot about opportunities here in the future of transplant, but really what we're still challenged with every day, as you heard from Bob this morning, is this great organ shortage. And we have to have a contingency plan. And as donors are rare relative to the needs of the community, we have to empower patients to choose life, having the data and knowledge to empower them to make decisions that they have to make every day today. And I'm going to tell you some very hard facts and some very difficult truths of the challenges in living with kidney disease today. But this is important to know because waiting is not acceptable, as you'll see in some of this data. Now, I've been using this slide for a really long time, and it's very apropos to today. So 75 years ago, let's see if we have a pointer, the mouse. Oh, yeah, it's good. So this guy we thought was going to revolutionize transplant about 75 years ago. And surprisingly, even though my family thinks I look a lot like that guy in terms of my genetic background, we're a lot closer to this one today than we are ever to the non-human primates in terms of moving forward with xenotransplantation. You're going to hear more about that from Dr. Montgomery later today. And when we think about this bioartificial type of kidney that's being developed as well, we think we're really close to this, but it's still not yet on the horizon until we get trials and FDA approval for things like this. Again, we're still really stuck with making difficult decisions about using dialysis machines, and human kidneys are really the only thing we have today to help patients and save their lives. And again, so what we're going to talk about is choosing life, understanding the risks and the challenges that you're stuck with right now to making key decisions, reducing your waiting time. Waiting is not acceptable. Generating a plan, choosing your donor options, and then saying yes. And the really difficult secret that I'm going to tell you today, if you're a patient sitting in the room or on the virtual platform, is that many transplant centers, if not most transplant centers, are making decisions for you every day that we want you to be more involved with, but you're not. And until you empower yourselves, until we empower you to be part of this complex decision-making process of which organ is the right organ for you, we end up making these decisions on your behalf. And I strongly encourage you to get engaged with your transplant teams and make these choices, and you got to have the data. So here's the data, and this is tough data to swallow. So when you are born into this world, if you look all the way on the right side of your screen, if you're a kid, you're expecting to live another 71 to 75 years. But if you're a kid that ends up in kidney failure, you're expecting to now live only 24 years, perhaps. If you get transplanted as a child and you never go on dialysis, we may triple that life expectancy by avoiding kidney failure. But the sad news is kidney failure is a horribly dangerous silent disease that you can't feel until it's too late. So when most people are sitting on dialysis or they're coming into our offices to talk to us, they feel fine. They're like, look, I just ran a marathon. I went into the ER because I had a headache and they told me my creatinine was 9 and I was going to die if I didn't start dialysis. How does that happen? And so it's very hard for patients to swallow the fact that they're really sick and their life is at risk when you feel good. When you need a heart and you need a liver and you need a lung, you feel sick. When you have end organ disease of those other very critically life-saving organs, you feel sick and you get it. But when you're a kidney patient and have a GFR of 18 and you're really close to needing some treatment, you feel pretty good. And with modern medical care, you can live really well with chronic kidney disease stage 4 or 5. So that's the sad news. And when you look at this curve, when you map it out, again, the blue line shows the US population and life expectancy by year. And you can see the benefit of transplant over dialysis, but it doesn't even transplant. Again, if you can transplant people before they suffer the complications of kidney failure, you can get closer to life expectancy for the general population. But the more time you sit with renal failure, the longer you stay on dialysis, the sicker you get. And I tell patients, for every day you're on dialysis, you lose 3 at the end of your life, not tomorrow. And that's the challenge, is that tomorrow you feel you're going to wake up and you're going to do this again and everything's fine, but you just lost 3 days and you're just not thinking about that. And that's unfortunate. That's a human thing to think about. So what is the risk while I wait? The risk while you wait, if you look at the upper right, if you look at pre-transplant mortality for adults on the waiting list by age, and again, the older group is at the top, the 65-year-olds and older in green, close to 10% of them per year are going to die waiting for a kidney. And if you look at the other groups, obviously, if you're younger, 18 to 31, there's still a mortality rate while waiting on the waiting list. And so understanding the risk benefit to you about making choices comes down to, number one, how old you are, what the waiting time is going to be in your region or where you are, what disease process you have. If you look at the bottom right, which talks about the diseases that we have, diabetes and hypertension are the 2 most common diseases in the world that create kidney failure. They're not specific to kidneys. They cause a lot of other diseases as well, but the kidney is unfortunately an innocent bystander for diabetics and hypertensives. So diabetics are sicker than the other groups. If you have a cystic kidney disease or other acquired kidney diseases, generally you'll be healthier than those that have systemic diseases that cause cardiovascular risk, such as diabetes and hypertension. So if you're 65 years old and have diabetes, your mortality waiting is fairly high while you're on dialysis. And if you look on the left side, if you look at race and ethnicity, it's going to vary, not necessarily because one race or one ethnic background is going to necessarily be sicker, but genetically there are differences, of course, in our genetic makeups. Some of this is access to healthcare. Some of this is education. Some of this is knowledge, and some of this is where you live. But who you are, how old you are, and what disease process is very specific to you. And yet we try to treat everyone the same. And so you are the only one that knows you. And so you have to make a decision based on your risk, what you need to do to move forward so you can choose life. Now, unfortunately, you heard that there are about 95,000 people waiting for a kidney today. We add about 46,000 people to the wait list every year and only transplant about 25 or 26,000 patients with a kidney transplant. So the list keeps growing and the needs are complicated. So when Mark Hardy on my left here trained me 25 years ago, I don't remember ever transplanting someone over 70 back then. This is routine today. You can argue that it's my expertise of transplanting 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds, which we just didn't do. So patients are sicker than they've ever have been in terms of needing an organ. On top of that, I don't ever remember receiving a deceased donor kidney over the age of 60, let alone DCD, meaning after their heart already stopped and the kidney had no more blood flow, which you're going to hear more about. So kidney selection was simpler and patient care was simpler. Now, fast forward to 20 years later, we're taking care of older, sicker patients with more complicated transplants. And where you live, looking at this slide right here, pre-transplant mortality among waitlisted patients varies by where you live in this country, which is crazy. You would think, how is it possible in the United States, which we think has the best organ donation and transplant system in the world, that if you live in one state, look at California, how's it possible that you can live in the Bay Area and have a risk that's 3 to 4-fold if you live in Virginia? It makes no sense, but that's the reality of what waiting times are. People in Northern California still have a 10 to 12-year wait. In New York City, prior to 2021, we would say that patients waited somewhere between 7 and 10 years. Now, because of changes in allocation, we've changed that. But it's actually taken 40 years since NOTA, or since developing the modern organ system that we have today, to learn how to allocate organs more effectively, more equitably for patients. But yet you can still see that there's great challenges in distribution. The sad story today is that while organ donation is at its peak, meaning we recover more deceased organ donors than we ever have in the history of the United States, 28%, over 1 in 4 kidneys that is recovered for the purposes of transplant is not being used, is being non-used or discarded, that could theoretically help save someone. And when I educate my own staff and surgeons around this country, I ask them, is this kidney better than dialysis? And is there someone in this country that you can save with this kidney that's better than dialysis? So we're not looking for perfect. We are looking for better than dialysis, because that's what we're left with right now in terms of choosing life. Transplant rates disproportionately affect waiting times on the waiting list. So here's the other secret to understand. If, again, even though I consider myself still a New York transplanter, I jumped ship and went 7 miles across the bridge, and thank you for welcoming me back to New York. I think it's probably out of pity, but I am a New Jersey transplanter now. But even within my state, if you look at transplant rates by institutions, it can vary 2 to 4-fold. In the United States, transplant hospitals can vary 8-fold or more in terms of organ selection and recruitment and utilization from one hospital to the next, and they may only be 10 miles away. How is that possible? Well, you have Yankees and you have Mets. That's the story. Sorry, David Cohen. But it's a good year. It's a good year, and we're happy to see the Mets in the game. But that's the reality of it, is that transplant center behavior and organ acceptance rates, which you have no idea about as a patient, also impact your ability to receive a deceased donor organ. And I'm going to share a little bit more of that secret. So when you look at this time, so if you look at year 0 to year 3, if you're a patient on a waiting list, the dark blue represents those that are waitlisted on dialysis. And in year 1, about 15% receive a deceased donor, 12% receive a living donor, and some of them, unfortunately, don't make it to year 2. But when you look at year 2, you still have the great majority are on dialysis still. Some are 21% are getting transplanted with deceased donors. And by year 3, you still have a large number on the waiting list, and some are delisted because they got too sick, and about 10% aren't here anymore. So when you look at the national wait list death rate, which is about 5% per year, Average waiting time in the United States is somewhere between 3 and 4 years, if you look at the median throughout the country. So choosing the center that's the right center for you, choosing the right organ options that accelerate your ability to get off the waiting list is the most important thing for your life today. And that's what we're going to move into next. What are your options? So let's look at life. And so when you look at these 4 curves, I'm going to try to highlight here. So if you're on hemodialysis, 5 years, there will be 40% of patients will be alive after being on dialysis for 5 years. And you can see that peritoneal dialysis isn't any different, because in reality, those 2 forms of doing dialysis might be different in terms of how you utilize them and resources and the amount of effort you put in. At the end of the day, you're still in kidney failure. And so the risk of death is not the form of dialysis. It's that you have ESRD, and cardiovascular risk goes up dramatically every year you're on. And so risk of dying of a stroke or heart attack is somewhere between 5 and 20%, depending on your age again and your medical risk. How do we change that? Well, the type of dialysis isn't changing that. So what changes that is the type of transplant you get. That's it. So your options are choosing life, which is transplant is much better as a treatment choice than dialysis in terms of longevity. If you look at 5-year survival on the deceased donor transplant side, it's double what it is on dialysis. So 80% of people have a life expectancy of 80% there compared to 40% at 5 years. Now, if you look at living donor transplant, it's even better, right? It's closer to 90% at 5 years. So these 2 curves at the bottom, no matter which type and what year you're on, you can see from year to year, it's a little different. But for the most part, transplant is dramatically better as a treatment choice than staying on the waiting list or getting even not being on the waiting list and remaining on dialysis. So let's go into those transplant options. Living donation is a lot like real estate, right? Location, location, location. This is living donation, living donation, living donation. Living donation is the best way to receive a kidney transplant, hands down. Shorter waiting times, so you don't have to sit on a waiting list if you have a potential living donor. Kidneys from living donors have immediate organ function nearly 99% of the time, and that reduces your risk of having complications and shortens your length of stay, and actually reduces risks of rejection and improves long-term health. And it's also the healthiest donor kidney you can receive and has the best long-term kidney survival. When I started in this field, we were talking about survivals in terms of kidney survival at half-life of being about 5 to 10 years. Now we're talking 17 to 20 years, where half of the patients that have living donor kidneys have function at about 20 years. There are patients that we still take care of that have kidneys functioning for 40 plus years. Amazing. And that change is not really in technique. We still sew a kidney in the same way we did, whether you use a robot or not. At the end of the day, it's changes in immunosuppression and picking up earlier rejection through technology is really going to be the change in the future. And this is you're going to hear more about later today. So what can you do? This is what you can do. You can ask your family. You can ask a friend. You can make a bumper sticker. You can put a T-shirt on and walk around Disney World, which apparently worked well for a patient. You can tell your story on social media. You can build a microsite. There's a company called NKR that helps patients do this all the time. These are incredible opportunities to build a vignette about yourself. You can work with a paired exchange program if you have a compatible or incompatible donor to make things work faster. Something called voucher donation is really incredible. You can find a voucher donor. This is someone that wants to give a kidney today away to someone in need and gets a voucher to hand out to someone in their family or their friends that might need a kidney 20 years from now. And that gives people an opportunity to think about the future. If you're born into a diabetic family and you know your child's a type 1 diabetic, you might say, I'll give my kidney in a couple years because my daughter might need one in 10 years if her diabetes isn't controlled. So that concept is incredibly innovative and it's changing lives. Contacting a living donor assistance organization. There are a handful of these now. I'm not going to mention them by name, but there are a number that started even within New York City alone. Probably more of them have started in New York City and New York Metro. And these folks help people find living donors. Things you shouldn't do: sit and do nothing. But that's what we do. As humans, we sit and wait because it's easy to do so. This is an active process. You need to have a plan. Make a plan because your life depends on it. Finding a living donor not only takes away a kidney, which is what most people think. I don't want someone to give a kidney because what if? Well, that donation not only helps you as a recipient, but it also helps the donor in so many ways. There are emotional benefits, there are physical benefits, there are life benefits. And unfortunately, as an organization, as a country, we haven't really wrapped our hands and heads around how to really incentivize living donation because it's become stagnant. We'll talk a little bit more of the numbers. Kidney paired donation, or KPD, has really kind of revolutionized opportunities for people to get donor kidneys, living donor kidneys, when they were incompatible. We thought that incompatible transplant was going to change the world, and we learned that that wasn't the case. And giving kidneys away, which I talk about like exchanging baseball cards, everyone ends up with the right thing. People are happy, and we no longer have to use complex immunosuppression with a limited kidney that was incompatible to begin with. So this is something that we have to talk to our donors about as well. I won't go into too much of this concept. You may be familiar with it, but the way paired exchange works is you take incompatible donors and you swap them, and two people that weren't getting transplanted end up with two kidneys that are now compatible and healthy. And then the most innovative concept is creating something called a chain, where a recipient has a potential donor, that donor gives to a different recipient, that recipient gives to the next recipient, and it creates a donation change of incompatible pairs. And at the end, you are left over with a donor that was matched to another recipient, and that donor is considered a bridge donor who could start another chain. And so that is happening every day, and that has really helped move the needle in living donation. But if you can see here, the living donation numbers are essentially flat and probably decreasing over time. There are less compatible less related donors donating than non-related donors today. And some of this is genetics. Some of this is understanding more about genetic background and disease predisposition in terms of being born into a family with kidney disease. But at the end of the day, we're not moving the needle. There aren't enough living donors for the number of people who need transplants. Now, the great news is you can see the deceased donor curve is rising. And that's through incredible opportunities we've done throughout the national transplant and donation system, and doing national collaboratives and learning from each other. So now I'm going to give you some pearls about navigating the waiting list. And some of these are trade secrets, and they shouldn't be, but they have been. And this is where you get engaged as a patient. You need to be part of this, understanding and navigating the waiting list, because it's not my waiting list. It's your waiting list. And I'm going to do everything to find a kidney for this list, but you have to say yes. And you can't say yes without understanding this. So the first thing to understand is there's no perfect kidney. All of these kidneys are used parts. They're all recycled parts. And I talk about cars. It's very similar. It's easy to understand a car. We call them pre-certified now because we don't like to say they're used. But when you pre-certify a Lexus and you say you go to the dealer and you get a pre-certified Lexus with 10,000 miles, you kind of understand that's better than getting a Toyota or Ford with 300,000 miles. When you compare those, you get it. The older used car that's been driven longer may still work just fine to get you to work every day, but it may not last 15 years. And so everyone's looking for that ideal kidney that is going to be that perfect kidney, but there is no perfect kidney. This is the first time in your life you want to be average, right? We're all looking to get an A+, as I watch my senior in high school try to navigate his GPA. That we all look for, but not here. This is not a game of A plus. No way. This is a game of average. We want to recycle every kidney that's going to save someone that we can, even kidneys that are less than average in many ways. And when you would argue, why would we take a less than average kidney? Well, if you're 78 years old, you have a GFR of 16, and your decision tree is to go on dialysis or not. You go to a transplant center and they say, we don't transplant anyone over the age of 70, so you have no options. So then you have to choose a transplant center that may take a recipient who's 75, and getting a less than average kidney that's going to work right away for you may only last you 7 years, but that 7 years of keeping you off dialysis is incredibly life-saving for what you need, not what a 25-year-old needs. And so understanding your risk is key. Every donor has risk. There's social risk, infection risk, cancer risk. There was actually one time where at the national level, where there was a consideration that, there was so much donor risk factors that we were considering increased risk. It was like nearly a third of the population of New York City was considered high risk as a donation just because of our own behaviors, which is a little crazy. So what about social risk? Well, in the fact that we can detect infections to the infinite degree at this point, based on DNA and RNA testing that we can pick up so readily, taking any donor, regardless of risk today, is perfectly safe. Almost perfectly safe. Not zero, but nearly close to zero. KDPI we'll talk a little bit more about. This is a kidney score given to a donor that helps you decide about longevity of the organ you might be taking. Understanding DCD, I'm going to mention a little bit more about that, donation after circulatory or cardiac death. 25 years ago, we really did not use a lot of donors with this type of donation. And today, it's nearly 40% of the donor pool in the United States, which creates a little bit of early functional risk to a recipient. And of course, transplant center behavior, which you don't even think about as a patient. You're told to go to this center because they're real close to you and they're really nice people. That's great. I can tell you there are 256 centers in the United States that do kidney transplant. They all do a really good job. And whether we nickel and dime and say one person has a 93%, 94%, you have 3 bars, 4 bars, whatever, in terms of survival, all of these transplant centers are filled with dedicated people that do an amazing job at saving lives. But each center, again, kind of like the Yankees and Mets, are different organizations and have different structures, and some perform differently. And so understanding that helps you choose a center that's right for you. So what do you need to know? Almost any kidney is better than dialysis. As I showed you, regardless of the type of kidney or KDPI, even the worst kidneys have survival at 5 years of nearly 80%, but dialysis is 40%. That choice of life, when you don't have access to a transplant, is critically important to understand when you're saying, you know what, I don't want to take a high-risk kidney. I don't want to take a weaker kidney. But when you're left with sitting 3 years on that dialysis curve, as your risk of dying goes up, that's an important decision. So the longer you wait, the sicker you get. While there is never zero risk, all donors are safe regardless of social risk factors. I just mentioned that. And accepting a donor kidney that has hepatitis, which is something that you would say, well, why would I want hepatitis? If I'm going to get hepatitis from taking a donor kidney, that doesn't seem right with me, except for the fact that we can cure that hepatitis with nearly 100% today because of modern medications. Getting a kidney is much safer than worrying about hepatitis anymore. But this is something that was taboo 30 years ago, even less. So how to select the right transplant center comes down to something like this. So you can go in right now to this website called the Scientific Registry for Transplant Recipients. All transplant hospitals are required to share this data with you. They're required to share this data, this website, and say, this is where you have the options to go and choose the right transplant center. You put in your zip code, you put in your state, and it will print out whatever centers are nearest you. You can put it by mileage. And it lists on the right-hand side 1-year kidney survival for the program and getting a deceased donor transplant. Now, the crazy secret that you don't know is that whether one kidney program has a 4-bar survival versus a 2-bar survival, they're both really good. And they're both only within 2% or so of 1-year survival. So I don't want you to focus so much on that. But what does differ a lot by center is the transplant rate, which is getting a deceased donor transplant faster. And these 5 programs, which are all within 50 to 60 miles of each other, have dramatically different behaviors in terms of what they're willing to accept to help patients. You need to know that, and you need to know what the transplant center behavior is. And you're allowed to. That's okay. That drives change in your life. And my goal really is to help other transplant centers change their behavior as well to increase their transplant rate to the best of their ability to help save more people. So patients that are willing to accept a higher KDPI kidney will get transplanted faster. That's just a fact. Because about 25 to 30% of kidneys are considered higher KDPI. And that's a big chunk of those 10,000 potential deceased donors in the United States every year. And so when you look at the number of patients by age category that are willing to accept older donors or higher KDPI kidneys, it's not surprising that older patients are more likely to accept than younger patients. But if you're 50 to 60 and only 50% of the country is willing to accept one, you know what? Your life is still dramatically better getting a higher KDPI kidney sooner than waiting on dialysis longer. And this was a study that I did back, when I was real young, back at Columbia in my days. We looked at, are you better off waiting on the list and getting what we called a standard criteria kidney at the time, or coming off the list and getting what we called an expanded criteria kidney, which is a slightly weaker kidney. And it turns out that patients, when we looked at 80,000 people that got transplanted, patients who got an expanded criteria kidney faster lived longer than those who waited on the list for standard criteria kidneys. That's important to understand. This is what KDPI is. KDPI, again, it's calculated based on the following donor characteristics on the left, but older or higher risk or functional risk kidneys that have a higher KDPI will not last as long theoretically in recipients and function as well over time, but still better than dialysis. So understanding that means that you're making a choice that getting a kidney that might be slightly weaker but faster is better for your life. It's not better for everyone, but again, where you are in this mix makes all the difference, So, and adults that are willing to accept hepatitis B or hepatitis C kidneys will also get transplanted faster. And you can see those that are willing to accept these back in 2022 has gone up by 50%. This is a study that just shows that the outcomes are great. I'm going to cut through this. And this is an annual report that shows the number of hepatitis C donations and successful transplants has gone up. You can see, essentially 600 times compared to where it was back in 2005, 2006. DCD is the type of donation. There's 2 ways to die in the United States, formally, brain death and cardiac death. The vast majority of the people that pass away in the United States die of a cardiac death outside of the hospital. If that happens, there's essentially no way to recover those organs safely for transplant in the US. They do that all the time in Spain, but they don't do it so well here. So essentially, if a patient dies within a hospital, whether of a brain death or cardiac death, they can become an organ donor. And that represents a very small fraction of the potential of the donor pool in the United States. But when you look at 2023, in red, about a third are DCD. And what DCD means is the heart stops first before the organs are recovered, which puts the organs a little bit at a disadvantage early on because they don't have blood supply. But when you look at this curve here, the 2 lines, you can't even see the blue line, but brain dead and cardiac dead donors at 5 years have the same outcomes. So getting a DCD kidney, when you discuss this with your team, has the same long-term benefits to you. So in summary, waiting is the hardest part. If you listen to Tom Petty, the waiting is the challenge here. And so waiting is the hardest part. Living donation is the best way to get a kidney transplant by far. Finding a living donor requires work, time, and collaboration. Sitting around is losing days of your life. Increasing your opportunity to receive a deceased donor kidney faster is critically important. You need to take control of your treatment options and choose the right transplant center for your needs and be data-driven about it, and use your team at the transplant hospital to have the right risk-benefit discussion about your next year while waiting. Thank you very much.